Dr. Evelyn Carter, a dedicated physician who has spent her life helping others, stumbles upon an elderly man, Harold Green, struggling not just with groceries, but with the weight of losing the only home he has ever known. For over 30 years, Harold has lived in this neighborhood, a place filled with memories of his late wife and the life they built together. Now he's facing relentless harassment from a powerful corporation, Meridian Development, determined to force him and his neighbors out. Moved by Harold's resilience and angered by the injustice, Evelyn steps in. What begins as a simple act of kindness quickly pulls her into a battle far larger than she imagined. As intimidation escalates and threats emerge not just against Harold, but against Evelyn herself, the two must navigate a fight for their community's survival. They rally their neighbors, confront relentless retaliation, and challenge systemic greed, all while inspiring hope and unity in their fight for justice. But how far will Meridian Development go to silence them? And will Evelyn and Harold's courage be enough to overcome the odds stacked against them? The soft morning sun filtered through the sheer curtains of Dr. Evelyn Carter's modest home, casting warm patches of light across the wooden floor. Outside, the sound of sparrows chirping blended with the gentle hum of life stirring in the suburban neighborhood. It was one of those rare mornings where Evelyn, a dedicated emergency physician, had the luxury of enjoying a moment of peace. Her home was small but welcoming. Photos of family gatherings lined the walls, snapshots of her late parents, and a few cherished pictures of herself in her white coat, a testament to years of perseverance. Despite its warmth, the house often felt quiet, too quiet. Her career had demanded long hours and personal sacrifices, leaving little room for family or a social life. Evelyn sat on the front porch, a steaming mug of coffee in hand. She wore a simple cotton robe and let the cool breeze brush against her skin. For a moment, she closed her eyes, savoring the rare stillness. The faint aroma of blooming roses from her garden reached her, mingling with the earthy smell of the damp grass from last night's rain. As she looked out onto the street, her mind wandered. She thought about the patients she had treated the night before. A man with a heart attack, a young mother in a car accident, an elderly woman who had come in simply because she was lonely and didn't know who else to turn to. Evelyn's heart ached for them all. She had chosen this path out of a desire to heal, but the weight of what she could not fix often lingered. Her thoughts were interrupted by the familiar sight of Mrs. Ruiz, her elderly neighbor, walking her small terrier, Toby. The two shared a quick wave. Evelyn was grateful for moments like these, small reminders of connection in a world that often felt overwhelming. Feeling restless, she decided to take a walk to the farmer's market a few blocks away. She slipped into a pair of sneakers and grabbed her reusable bag. The market was one of the highlights of her neighborhood, a lively space filled with the vibrant colors of fresh produce, the chatter of vendors, and the occasional musician playing for tips. As Evelyn strolled past stalls selling everything from ripe peaches to fragrant herbs, she felt a sense of contentment. She paused at a stall selling sunflowers, their bright yellow petals a cheerful contrast to her often somber work environment. As she handed a few dollars to the vendor, she noticed a commotion near the edge of the market. An older black man, thin and frail, was struggling to carry several heavy grocery bags. His brow was furrowed in concentration, and his hands shook with effort. Evelyn's gaze darted around, noticing how the crowd moved past him, heads turned or eyes downcast. She walked over quickly. "Sir, do you need help?" she asked gently. The man hesitated, his pride clearly wrestling with his need for assistance. Finally, he nodded. "Thank you, ma'am. These bags seem to be heavier than I expected," he said, his voice raspy but kind. Evelyn took two of the bags from him, her trained eyes noticing faint bruises on his wrists. "Are you all right?" she asked, her tone soft but concerned. "Oh, I'm fine," he replied quickly, almost too quickly. "Just getting old is all. These bones don't work like they used to." Evelyn didn't press further, sensing his discomfort. As they walked together to the bus stop, he introduced himself as Harold Green, a longtime resident of the area. They chatted about the market, his late wife, and his love of gardening. Despite his polite demeanor, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to his story. When they reached the bus stop, she placed his bags down carefully. "It was nice meeting you, Mr. Green," she said. "If you ever need anything, I live on Mulberry Street, just a few blocks away." He gave her a grateful smile. "You have a kind heart, young lady. We don't see enough of that these days." As Evelyn walked home, the image of Mr. Green's bruised wrists stayed with her. She had seen similar marks before on patients who had faced abuse or neglect. The thought unsettled her, but she told herself she didn't have enough information to jump to conclusions. That evening, as she sat at her kitchen table eating a simple dinner of grilled vegetables, Evelyn found herself reflecting on her own life. She had worked hard to build a career as a doctor, navigating the challenges of being a black woman in a field often dominated by others. But the isolation of her success weighed heavily. Her job gave her purpose, yet it also left little room for anything else. Her phone buzzed, breaking her train of thought. It was a message from her younger sister, Naomi, who lived in Chicago. "Naomi, hey big sis. Just checking in. Don't work too hard, okay? Love you." Evelyn smiled faintly, typing a quick response. "Thanks, Naomi. Try to take it easy today. Love you too." The rest of the evening passed quietly, but as she prepared for bed, Evelyn couldn't help but feel a lingering unease. Something about Mr. Green's situation didn't sit right with her. She resolved to keep an eye out for him the next time she visited the market. The following morning, Evelyn woke up to the sound of distant thunder. Rain clouds loomed overhead, casting a gray hue over the neighborhood. As she sipped her coffee, her thoughts returned to Mr. Green. She wondered what his life was like when he wasn't at the market. Did he have family nearby? Was he truly all right, as he had insisted? Deciding she needed to stretch her legs, Evelyn grabbed an umbrella and headed to the park. The air was cool and damp, the earthy scent of wet leaves filling her senses. She found a bench under a large oak tree and opened the book she had brought, hoping to lose herself in its pages. As she read, the sound of raised voices caught her attention. She looked up and saw Mr. Green sitting on a nearby bench, his groceries beside him. Two men in construction uniforms stood in front of him, their body language aggressive. Evelyn couldn't hear their exact words, but the tone was unmistakably hostile. Her heart raced as she closed her book and stood. This wasn't the kind of situation she could ignore. With steady steps, she approached, her mind already forming a plan. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. The two men turned to face her, their expressions shifting from irritation to surprise. One of them, a stocky man with a hard face, crossed his arms. "This doesn't concern you, lady," he said, his tone dismissive. Evelyn squared her shoulders. "It does if you're harassing him. He has as much right to sit here as anyone else." Mr. Green looked at her, a mix of gratitude and embarrassment in his eyes. The men muttered something under their breath, but eventually backed off, clearly not wanting to cause a scene. As they walked away, Evelyn sat beside Mr. Green. "Are you all right?" she asked. He nodded, though his hands trembled slightly. "Thank you, Dr. Carter. I don't know what I'd have done without you." Evelyn felt a swell of determination. She didn't know exactly what was going on, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to let it continue. Evelyn walked Mr. Green home that day, her umbrella shielding them both from the drizzle. The walk was quiet, save for the occasional small talk about the weather or the history of the neighborhood. Mr. Green spoke with pride about the area, reminiscing about when the park had been a gathering place for families, back before many of his neighbors were forced to leave. As they neared his building, Evelyn's attention turned to its condition. The paint on the walls was peeling, and the sidewalk leading to the entrance was cracked and uneven. A rusty mailbox stood slightly askew, as though it had been struck and never repaired. Mr. Green fumbled for his keys, his hands trembling slightly as he unlocked the door. The lobby was dimly lit, with an air of neglect that felt heavier than the rain outside. Evelyn's heart sank as she noticed the stark contrast between this building and the newer developments a few blocks away. "Home sweet home," Mr. Green said with a thin smile, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "Do you live alone?" Evelyn asked gently, looking around. He nodded. "My wife, Clara, passed 5 years ago. It's just me now. Most of the folks I knew have moved away or been moved out, if you know what I mean." The phrase struck Evelyn. She had heard about gentrification forcing longtime residents out of their homes, but seeing its effects firsthand gave her a new perspective. Mr. Green hesitated before gesturing toward a modest door at the end of the hall. "Would you like some tea? It's the least I can offer for your kindness." Evelyn smiled, touched by the gesture. Inside his apartment, the space was neat but sparsely furnished. Family photos adorned one wall, though many frames held faded images of people Evelyn guessed had long passed. A small collection of potted plants thrived on the windowsill, their leaves lush and green despite the gloom outside. As Mr. Green busied himself in the kitchen, Evelyn glanced around and noticed a stack of envelopes on the counter. One envelope, its red lettering bold against the white paper, caught her eye. "Final notice. Past due," it read. Evelyn quickly looked away, not wanting to invade his privacy. He returned with 2 steaming cups of tea, handing one to her with a smile. "Chamomile. Good for the nerves," he said. They sat in silence for a moment, the rhythmic sound of rain tapping against the window filling the room. Then Evelyn decided to address what had been troubling her. "Mr. Green, can I ask you something?" He looked up, his expression wary but curious. "Those men in the park, was that the first time they've approached you like that?" He sighed, the weight of his years etched deeply into his face. "No, it wasn't. They work for the construction company that bought this building. They've been trying to scare me into leaving, just like they did with the others. They want to tear this place down and build some fancy condos. Folks like me don't fit their plans." The matter-of-fact way he said it made Evelyn's chest tighten. She leaned forward, her tea forgotten. "Have you reported this to anyone?" "The police." Mr. Green gave a hollow laugh. "The police? No, ma'am. They don't care about an old black man like me. I've lived here over 30 years, but that doesn't mean a thing to them or to the people who bought this place." Evelyn's mind raced. She thought of the bruises on his wrists, the eviction notices she had glimpsed, and now the harassment in the park. It was a pattern too familiar to ignore. "I can help," she said firmly. He looked at her, startled. "You've already done more than enough. You don't need to get involved in all this." "With all due respect, Mr. Green, I think I do. This isn't just about you. If they get away with this here, it'll keep happening to others." Her determination seemed to give him pause. He studied her for a long moment before nodding slowly. "All right," he said softly. "If you really want to help, I won't stop you. But don't let this fight take too much from you, Dr. Carter. It's not an easy one." Over the next few days, Evelyn couldn't stop thinking about Mr. Green. She found herself researching tenant rights during her breaks at work and making calls to local advocacy groups. She learned that the construction company, Meridian Development, had a history of targeting low-income neighborhoods, often using underhanded tactics to displace residents. On her next day off, she decided to visit the market again, hoping to run into Mr. Green. Instead, she found herself face-to-face with an unexpected situation. At the entrance to the market, a young black boy no older than 10 was sitting on the ground, his knees pulled up to his chest. His clothes were damp from the drizzle, and his small frame shivered in the cool air. Evelyn crouched down beside him. "Hey there, are you all right?" The boy looked up, his eyes wide and wary. "I'm waiting for my mom," he mumbled, though the way he avoided her gaze made Evelyn suspect otherwise. "Where is she?" Evelyn asked gently. "She said she'd be back soon," he said, but his tone lacked conviction. Evelyn felt a pang of concern. "Do you mind if I wait with you?" He hesitated before nodding. They sat together on the edge of the market, the bustling crowd passing by without a second glance. Evelyn didn't press him further, sensing he needed time to feel safe. After a while, a woman approached a vendor from one of the stalls. She knelt down and placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Caleb, your mom couldn't come back, but I told her I'd look after you until she could. You hungry?" The boy nodded, and the woman handed him a sandwich. Evelyn watched the exchange, her heart warming at the woman's quiet act of kindness. "Thank you for helping him," Evelyn said as the woman stood. The vendor shrugged. "It's nothing. We all have to look out for each other, don't we?" The words lingered with Evelyn long after she returned home. That evening, she called Mr. Green. "Hello," he answered, his voice cautious. "Hi, Mr. Green. It's Dr. Carter. I wanted to let you know I've been doing some research, and I think we have options. I know some people who might be able to help." There was a long pause before he spoke. "You don't give up, do you?" Evelyn smiled. "Not when something's worth fighting for." For the first time, she heard a small chuckle on the other end of the line. "All right, Dr. Carter, let's see what we can do." As she hung up, Evelyn felt a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced in a long time. The fight ahead would be tough, but she wasn't alone. Acts of kindness, big and small, had a way of creating ripples, and she was determined to make them count. The rain had passed, leaving the air fresh and cool as Evelyn made her way back to the park where she had first encountered the two men harassing Mr. Green. The wide expanse of green grass sparkled with droplets under the sun, but the serenity of the scene did little to calm the tension in her chest. She had spent the morning meeting with a local tenants advocacy group and explaining Mr. Green's situation. Though the group had been supportive, providing resources and legal advice, they warned Evelyn that cases like his were often difficult to win. Without documentation of harassment or illegal tactics, it would be hard to hold the construction company accountable. "Get videos, witnesses, anything you can," one of the advocates, a no-nonsense woman named Karen Wells, had told her. These companies thrive on intimidation because most people feel powerless. They count on folks being too scared to fight back. Now, as Evelyn walked through the park, she felt the weight of those words. She couldn't shake the image of Mr. Green's weary face, his dignity eroded by years of quiet struggles that had gone unnoticed by the world. Her thoughts were interrupted by raised voices ahead. She quickened her pace, her heart sinking as she recognized Mr. Green seated on a bench near the edge of the park. Two men in construction uniforms loomed over him, their body language as aggressive as the last time she had seen them. "You're trespassing, old man," one of them snarled. He was stocky, with a shaved head and a smirk that sent a chill through Evelyn. "This is a public park," Mr. Green said, his voice calm but tinged with weariness. "Not for long," the second man chimed in, his tone mocking. "Soon it'll be part of our new development. Maybe we'll put up a fountain where you're sitting." Evelyn's blood boiled. She had dealt with her share of bullies in the past, but something about their brazen cruelty toward Mr. Green made her skin crawl. Without hesitating, she stepped forward. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice steady but loud enough to carry across the clearing. The men turned, their expressions shifting to annoyance as they saw her. "What do you want, lady?" the stocky one asked, crossing his arms. Evelyn ignored his tone, focusing on Mr. Green. "Mr. Green, are you all right?" The older man gave her a faint nod, relief flickering in his eyes. "Mind your own business," the second man snapped. "This doesn't concern you." "It does if you're harassing him," Evelyn shot back. She stepped closer, her posture calm but commanding. "I suggest you step away. Now!" The stocky man let out a short laugh. "Or what? You gonna call the cops?" Evelyn's jaw tightened. She knew all too well how unreliable law enforcement could be in situations like this. Instead, she pulled her phone from her pocket and raised it, her thumb hovering over the record button. "No, but I will record this and make sure everyone sees how Meridian Development treats the people in this community," she said, her voice cold and deliberate. The smirk vanished from the men's faces. The second man glanced around, noticing for the first time that a few other park-goers had stopped to watch the scene unfold. "Look, we're just doing our job," the stocky one muttered, his bravado faltering. "Your job is to build, not bully," Evelyn said sharply. "Leave him alone." For a moment, it seemed like the men might push back, but the weight of the growing crowd and the camera in her hand seemed to sway them. With a muttered curse, they turned and walked off, their boots crunching against the damp gravel path. Evelyn lowered her phone and exhaled, the adrenaline leaving her shaky. She turned to Mr. Green, who was still sitting on the bench, his shoulders slumped. "Are you sure you're okay?" she asked, sitting beside him. He nodded slowly. "I'll be fine, thanks to you. Those two have been after me for weeks. They want me to quit, just like they did with the others." Evelyn frowned. "What happened to the others?" "They took the money Meridian offered and left," Mr. Green said bitterly. "It wasn't much, but enough to make them go quietly. They didn't have a choice. Most of them couldn't afford to fight back." "But you stayed," Evelyn said softly. He gave her a tired smile. "I've been here for over 30 years. Clara and I raised our family in that apartment. I'm not leaving unless I'm forced out. Evelyn felt a pang of admiration for his resolve. You shouldn't have to. We'll find a way to stop this. Mr. Green shook his head. I appreciate what you're trying to do, Dr. Carter, but I don't want you putting yourself at risk. These people don't care about rules or decency. They only care about money. That doesn't mean we stop fighting, Evelyn said firmly. That evening, Evelyn went back to her small home, her mind buzzing with plans. She reviewed the video she had recorded and made notes about the interaction. It wasn't much, but it was a start. She sent it to Karen Wells, along with a summary of Mr. Green's story. A few hours later, her phone buzzed. It was a text from Karen. This is great evidence. Keep documenting everything. We'll build a case. Evelyn felt a flicker of hope. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, she felt like they had a fighting chance. The next morning, Evelyn returned to the market to clear her head. As she wandered through the stalls, she noticed the young boy she had met before Caleb standing near a table of apples. He wasn't alone this time. The vendor from before, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, was chatting with him and handing him a small bag of fruit. Morning, Doc, the woman called out when she saw Evelyn. Good morning, Evelyn replied, smiling as she approached. It's nice to see you again. The woman gestured toward Caleb. This little one's been helping me out at the stall. His mom works late, so I told her I'd keep an eye on him. Caleb grinned, holding up the bag. She gave me apples. Evelyn felt her heart lift at the sight. Despite the challenges in her own life and the struggle she saw in the community, moments like these reminded her that kindness was still alive and well. Thank you, she said to the woman, for looking out for him. The vendor shrugged. We all have to look out for each other, don't we? Evelyn smiled, her determination renewed. As she left the market, she thought about what the vendor had said. It was a simple truth, but one that gave her strength. Evelyn returned home from the market, her mind brimming with ideas and plans. The vendor's words lingered in her thoughts. We all have to look out for each other. She knew she couldn't do this alone. Mr. Green's situation wasn't just about one man being harassed. It was a symptom of something much larger, a quiet erosion of dignity and community in the face of unchecked greed. She sat at her small desk, cluttered with medical journals and notes from her work, and opened her laptop. Karen Wells had sent a follow-up email with resources, including links to tenants' rights organizations and contacts for local reporters who might be interested in the story. Evelyn scrolled through the information, her determination growing with every line. One email caught her attention. Karen had mentioned a community meeting scheduled for the following evening at a local church. It was organized by a grassroots coalition fighting against gentrification and displacement. Evelyn made a note to attend. The next day, Evelyn visited Mr. Green after her shift at the hospital. She knocked on his door, the sound echoing faintly in the dimly lit hallway. When he opened the door, his face lit up with a faint smile. Dr. Carter, didn't expect to see you so soon. I wanted to check in on you, Evelyn said. She glanced past him into the apartment, noticing the stack of letters still sitting on the counter. Do you have a moment? Mr. Green hesitated before stepping aside. Of course. Come on in. Evelyn sat down at the small kitchen table while Mr. Green poured them both cups of tea. As he set the mugs down, she leaned forward. There's a community meeting tomorrow night at St. James Church, she said. It's about tenants' rights and fighting displacement. I think we should go together. Mr. Green frowned, his fingers tightening around his mug. I don't know, Dr. Carter. Those meetings can get heated, and I'm not sure they'll make much difference. Evelyn met his gaze, her voice steady. You told me you've been here for over 30 years, that this place is your home. If we don't stand up now, they'll take it from you and from others like you. I'll be there with you every step of the way. Mr. Green studied her for a long moment, the lines on his face deepening. Finally, he nodded. All right, I'll go, but only because you seem to believe in this so much. Evelyn smiled. That's all I ask. The next evening, Evelyn arrived at St. James Church to find the basement packed with people. Rows of folding chairs filled the room, and a low hum of conversation buzzed through the air. Some attendees were older residents like Mr. Green, while others were younger activists with notepads and laptops. Mr. Green shuffled in beside her, looking around nervously. "It's been a while since I've been to one of these," he murmured. "You're not alone," Evelyn reassured him, placing a hand on his shoulder. The meeting began with introductions from the coalition leaders, who outlined the challenges facing the community. They spoke of rising rents, forced evictions, and the predatory practices of developers like Meridian Development. One speaker, a young man named Marcus, shared a story about his family being displaced from their home of 20 years. His voice cracked as he described watching his grandmother cry as they packed up their belongings, unsure of where they would go next. Evelyn glanced at Mr. Green, whose jaw was tight. She could see the pain of recognition in his expression. When it was time for questions, Evelyn raised her hand. "What's the best way for residents to protect themselves if they're being harassed or pressured to leave?" Karen Wells, seated at the front, answered, "Documentation is key. Keep a record of every interaction, dates, times, and details. Video evidence is even better. If anyone witnesses harassment, speak up and report it. The more voices we have, the harder it is for them to ignore us." As the meeting wrapped up, Evelyn noticed Mr. Green sitting quietly, lost in thought. She placed a hand on his arm. "Are you all right?" He nodded slowly. "It's a lot to take in, but I'm glad I came. Hearing everyone's stories, it makes me realize I'm not the only one." "You're definitely not," Evelyn said. "And now we have a plan." In the days that followed, Evelyn and Mr. Green worked together to document his experiences. She helped him write down every interaction he could remember with the men from Meridian Development. She also began asking around the neighborhood, speaking to other residents who had faced similar issues. One afternoon, while visiting Mr. Green, she noticed a young woman sitting on the stoop of the building. She was holding a clipboard and looked up as Evelyn approached. "Can I help you?" Evelyn asked, her tone cautious. The woman smiled. "I'm Nadia. I'm with a local tenants' rights group. We've been hearing about what's happening here, and I wanted to check in with the residents." Evelyn felt a surge of relief. "It's good to meet you, Nadia. I'm Dr. Evelyn Carter. I've been helping Mr. Green with his case." Nadia's face lit up. "That's wonderful. We could use more people like you. Can I speak with Mr. Green?" Evelyn led her inside, where the three of them sat down to discuss the next steps. Nadia explained that her group was planning a rally to draw attention to Meridian Development's practices. "We're inviting the media," she said. "The more eyes on this, the better." Mr. Green looked uncertain. "A rally? I'm not sure I'm cut out for that kind of thing." "You don't have to do anything you're not comfortable with," Evelyn said. "But your story matters, Mr. Green. If you're willing to share it, it could make a real difference." After a moment of silence, he nodded. "I'll do it. For Clara." She always believed in standing up for what's right. As Evelyn left the building that evening, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight ahead was daunting, but she was no longer alone. The community was beginning to come together, and for the first time, she felt the faint stirrings of hope. The rain began to fall softly as she walked back to her car. She tilted her face upward, letting the cool drops wash over her. "We all have to look out for each other," she thought again, the vendor's words echoing in her mind. Evelyn knew the road would be long and difficult, but she also knew this. When people stood together, they could accomplish the impossible. The next morning, Evelyn woke with a sense of determination, her thoughts already racing with what needed to be done. The rally Nadia had mentioned was scheduled for the upcoming weekend, leaving only a few days to prepare. As she sipped her coffee at the kitchen table, her phone buzzed with a message from Nadia. "Nadia, meeting tonight at the community center to finalize rally details. Can you and Mr. Green come? 7 p.m. Evelyn immediately responded. "We'll be there." She glanced at the clock, then grabbed her notebook and began jotting down ideas. She didn't just want to show up, she wanted to contribute in a meaningful way. Later that afternoon, Evelyn arrived at Mr. Green's apartment. The old man seemed livelier than usual, his small living room tidied up and a faint smell of tea lingering in the air. "You're in a good mood today," Evelyn remarked, smiling as she took a seat on the couch. "Well," Mr. Green said, lowering himself carefully into a chair opposite her. "You've got me doing things I never thought I'd do again. It feels good to have some fight left in me." Evelyn chuckled. "I'm glad to hear it. We need all the fight we can muster. She explained the meeting that evening, and Mr. Green agreed to join her. Before they left, Evelyn helped him gather some of the records they'd been compiling. Eviction notices, photos of the building's neglect, and notes about the harassment he'd faced. The community center buzzed with activity when they arrived. A diverse group of people, young and old, of various races and backgrounds, filled the room. Posters were being made at one table, while another group reviewed a list of local reporters who had been invited to the rally. Evelyn immediately spotted Nadia, who waved them over. "Dr. Carter, Mr. Green, glad you could make it," Nadia said, her enthusiasm infectious. "We got a lot to go over." As they joined the group, Evelyn felt a sense of belonging she hadn't expected. Though she was used to working in high-pressure environments, the energy in the room was different. This wasn't about triaging emergencies or rushing to save a life. It was about standing together, pooling resources, and pushing for change. Nadia led the discussion, outlining the rally's goals. "Our main objective is visibility," she said, her voice firm but passionate. "We want the community and the city to see what's happening here. We'll have speakers sharing their stories, and we're inviting the press to ensure this gets the attention it deserves." Several people nodded in agreement, but one older man raised a hand. "What if Meridian retaliates? They got money and lawyers. How do we fight back against that?" "That's why we document everything," Nadia replied. "We've already started building a legal case. The rally is just the first step. It's about showing them we're not afraid." Evelyn noticed Mr. Green shift uncomfortably in his chair. She leaned over and whispered, "Are you okay?" He nodded, though his expression was tight. "It's just a lot. I've never been one for crowds." "Don't worry," Evelyn said gently. "You don't have to do anything you're not comfortable with. Just being here is enough." As the meeting wrapped up, Evelyn volunteered to help with the event logistics. She was assigned to coordinate the lineup of speakers, which included Mr. Green. Afterward, she stayed behind to help clean up, chatting with Nadia as they folded chairs and gathered discarded paper. "You're really diving into this," Nadia said, her tone warm. "It's not every day we see a doctor stepping into community activism." Evelyn paused, considering her response. "It feels like a natural extension of what I do. Healing isn't just about medicine, it's about addressing the root causes of pain and inequality. If I can help in this way, I have to." Nadia smiled. "We're lucky to have you." As Evelyn drove Mr. Green home later that night, the old man finally broke the silence. "You've got a fire in you, Dr. Carter. Clara would have liked you." Evelyn glanced at him, touched. "Thank you, Mr. Green. That means a lot." The next few days were a whirlwind of preparation. Evelyn balanced her shifts at the hospital with late nights working on the rally. She called local businesses, asking for donations of water and snacks for attendees, and reached out to friends who might help spread the word. One afternoon, while delivering flyers to shops in the neighborhood, Evelyn experienced a moment of unexpected kindness. She had stopped at a bakery, hoping to leave some flyers on their counter. The owner, a stout woman named Mrs. Patel, glanced at the flyer and nodded approvingly. "This is about the Meridian people, yes?" Mrs. Patel asked. "Yes," Evelyn replied. "We're trying to push back against their tactics." Mrs. Patel reached under the counter and pulled out a tray of freshly baked cookies. "Take these for your rally." "On the house." Evelyn blinked, surprised. "That's so generous of you." "Are you sure?" Mrs. Patel smiled. "They've been harassing my customers for months. If I can help, even a little, I will." As Evelyn left the bakery, the warm smell of cookies wafting from the box in her hands, she felt a surge of gratitude. The community was coming together, piece by piece. The night before the rally, Evelyn sat in her living room, reviewing the final schedule. She had spoken to Mr. Green earlier in the evening, reassuring him that his story didn't have to be perfect, it just had to be honest. Her phone buzzed with a message from Karen Wells. "Good luck tomorrow. Remember, even small victories are steps forward." Evelyn smiled faintly, her resolve hardening. She knew the road ahead would be long, but she also knew that change started with moments like these, moments where people stood together, refusing to be silenced. As she prepared for bed, Evelyn thought of Mr. Green, of Nadia, of the boy Caleb, and the vendor who had looked out for him. All of them were part of a larger story, one of resilience and quiet defiance in the face of injustice. And tomorrow, they would take the next step. The morning of the rally dawned bright and clear, the sun casting long golden rays over the neighborhood. Evelyn arrived at the park early, her car packed with supplies. Volunteers were already setting up folding chairs and hanging banners. One banner stretched across 2 trees near the podium, its bold letters reading, "Protect our homes, protect our community." Mr. Green arrived shortly after, walking cautiously with his cane. Despite his usual reserved demeanor, he wore a clean button-down shirt, and Evelyn noticed he had trimmed his beard. "You look sharp, Mr. Green," she said with a warm smile, handing him a bottle of water. "Well, if I'm going to speak, I might as well look presentable," he replied, though his tone carried a note of nervousness. "You're going to do great," Evelyn reassured him. "Just speak from the heart. That's all anyone wants to hear." As the crowd began to gather, Evelyn could feel the energy in the air, a mix of anticipation, determination, and quiet anger. People trickled in steadily, holding signs that read things like "Affordable Housing for All" and "Stop Meridian Development." By the time the rally started, the park was packed. Evelyn stood near the podium, scanning the crowd and feeling a swell of pride. This wasn't just about Mr. Green anymore. It was about everyone who had been pushed out or was fighting to stay. The first few speakers set the tone, sharing stories of displacement and community loss. A young mother talked about how her rent had doubled in 2 years, forcing her to move farther from her job. An elderly man described how his building's management had neglected repairs to pressure tenants into leaving. When it was Mr. Green's turn, Evelyn guided him up to the podium, staying close in case he needed support. He adjusted the microphone, his hand trembling slightly. "My name is Harold Green," he began, his voice shaky but gaining strength. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 32 years. This is where I raised my family. It's where my wife and I made our life together." He paused, looking out at the crowd. "But now, people like me are being told we don't belong anymore, that we're just in the way of progress. Meridian Development wants my building so they can tear it down and build something fancy. They don't care about the people who live there, they care about money." The crowd murmured in agreement, their faces a sea of support. Mr. Green's voice grew steadier. "But I'm still here," he said, his tone firm. "I'm still here because this is my home, and I'm not leaving without a fight." The applause that followed was deafening. Evelyn felt a lump rise in her throat as she watched him step down from the podium, his shoulders straighter than she'd ever seen. "You did amazing," she whispered as he returned to her side. "Thank you," he said quietly, a faint smile on his lips. "I couldn't have done it without you." The rally continued smoothly, with the final speaker, a fiery young activist named Marcus, calling on the city council to take immediate action against Meridian Development's practices. Cameras from local news outlets captured every moment, and Evelyn felt a flicker of hope that this visibility would lead to change. But as the crowd began to disperse, a shadow fell over the event. Evelyn noticed 2 men standing near the edge of the park. Both wore Meridian Development badges clipped to their belts, and their body language was tense. One of them, the stocky man she had confronted before, was glaring directly at her. She nudged Nadia, who was collecting posters nearby. "Do you see those men?" Nadia followed her gaze and frowned. "Yeah, that's Meridian. They've been sending people to intimidate us at every rally." "What should we do?" "Nothing," Nadia said firmly. "Let them see we're not scared. Just keep an eye on them." Evelyn nodded, but her stomach churned. She hated the feeling of being watched, of knowing they were there to send a message. Later that evening, after the rally had ended and the park was nearly empty, Evelyn stayed behind to help clean up. As she carried a box of leftover flyers to her car, she noticed the 2 Meridian men lingering near the parking lot. They didn't say anything, but their presence was impossible to ignore. One of them lit a cigarette, the glow of the embers sharp against the dusk. Evelyn's heart pounded as she loaded the box into her trunk. She forced herself to act normal, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her unease. Just as she shut the trunk, a familiar voice called out, "Dr. Carter." She turned to see Mr. Green walking toward her, his cane tapping lightly against the pavement. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said, his expression concerned. "I'm fine," Evelyn said, though she was grateful for his company. The two Meridian men watched for another moment before finally walking away. Evelyn exhaled, her shoulders relaxing. "Thank you, Mr. Green," she said softly. He gave her a knowing look. "We got to look out for each other, don't we?" Evelyn smiled faintly. "We do." The next day, Evelyn received an unexpected call from Karen Wells. "I just heard from a reporter who covered the rally," Karen said. "They're running a story on Meridian Development's harassment tactics. It'll air tonight." Evelyn felt a surge of relief. "That's great news." "It is," Karen agreed. "But be prepared for backlash. Companies like Meridian don't take bad press lightly." Evelyn hung up, the excitement tempered by Karen's warning. She knew they had struck a nerve, but she also knew the fight was far from over. That evening, as the news segment aired, Evelyn sat with Mr. Green in his apartment, watching the story unfold. The footage from the rally was powerful, showing residents holding signs and speaking out against Meridian Development. Mr. Green's speech was featured prominently, his voice steady as he declared his refusal to leave. "You're a star now," Evelyn teased gently. Mr. Green chuckled. "I don't know about that, but if it helps the cause, I'm glad I did it." Evelyn nodded, though a knot of anxiety lingered in her chest. The attention was exactly what they needed, but it also put a target on their backs. As she left Mr. Green's apartment later that night, she noticed an envelope taped to his door. She pulled it down and opened it, her stomach sinking as she read the contents. It was a formal notice from Meridian Development, claiming Mr. Green was in violation of his lease due to unauthorized gatherings. Her hands shook as she folded the letter and placed it in her bag. They were retaliating, just as Karen had warned. But as she walked back to her car, Evelyn felt her resolve harden. They weren't going to back down, not now, not ever. The envelope in Evelyn's bag weighed heavier than it should have, its presence a constant reminder of Meridian Development's intimidation tactics. By the time she reached home, she had already made up her mind to call Karen Wells. "Karen, they've issued a lease violation notice to Mr. Green," Evelyn said as soon as Karen answered. There was a pause on the other end. "That was fast," Karen said grimly. "What's the reason?" "They're claiming the rally was an unauthorized gathering," Evelyn replied. "Con-site. That's retaliation, plain and simple. I'll loop in our legal team. This might be a scare tactic, but we can't ignore it. Keep everything documented." "I will," Evelyn said, trying to suppress the anger bubbling in her chest. "What's our next step?" "Let's escalate this," Karen said. "We'll draft a formal complaint and send it to the city's housing authority. This needs to be on record. In the meantime, keep supporting Mr. Green and the others. The more noise we make, the harder it'll be for them to operate in the shadows." Evelyn hung up, her mind spinning with questions. What would Meridian try next? How far were they willing to go to silence the community? The next morning, Evelyn visited Mr. Green to discuss the letter. She found him sitting at his kitchen table, the soft morning light filtering through the window. The letter was already spread out in front of him, his reading glasses perched on his nose. "I figured they'd pull something like this," he said quietly as Evelyn sat down. "They're trying to scare you," Evelyn said. "But we're not going to let them. Karen and her team are already working on it." Mr. Green nodded, but the weariness in his eyes was unmistakable. "I've been in this fight for a while now, Dr. Carter. Some days, it feels like no matter what we do, they'll find a way to win." Evelyn leaned forward, her voice firm. "They only win if we give up. You stood up at that rally and showed the whole community what's at stake. That matters. And we're not going to stop until they're held accountable." Her conviction seemed to steady him. He reached for his mug of tea and took a slow sip. "I hope you're right," he said softly. Over the next few days, tensions in the neighborhood escalated. Several residents reported receiving similar lease violation notices, each with flimsy justifications. The sense of unease grew as rumors spread about Meridian Development's plans to fast-track the building's demolition. Evelyn doubled down on her efforts, spending her evenings making phone calls and attending community meetings. Nadia and Karen worked tirelessly to organize another event, this time a town hall to confront Meridian representatives directly. "They're going to send their lawyers," Nadia warned during a late-night planning session. "They'll try to deflect, spin the narrative, make it seem like they're the victims. We need to be ready." Evelyn nodded. What can I do to help? Keep rallying the residents, Nadia said. We need as many voices as possible in that room. The night of the town hall arrived, and the atmosphere was electric. The community center was packed, the air heavy with both anger and determination. At the front of the room, a panel of Meridian representatives sat stiffly, their polished appearances in stark contrast to the residents gathered before them. Evelyn sat with Mr. Green and a few other tenants, her notebook open and pen in hand. She watched as the first few speakers stepped up to the microphone, each sharing their experiences of harassment and neglect. One elderly woman described how Meridian's contractors had accidentally shut off her water for 2 weeks. Another man recounted being served an eviction notice just days after refusing to accept a buyout offer. Evelyn could feel the tension in the room mounting. The Meridian representatives sat stone-faced, occasionally whispering to one another, but offering no response. When it was Evelyn's turn to speak, she stood and walked to the microphone, her heart pounding. She wasn't used to addressing crowds, but the stakes were too high to stay silent. "My name is Dr. Evelyn Carter," she began, her voice steady despite the nerves fluttering in her chest. "I'm here because I've seen firsthand the impact Meridian Development's actions have had on this community." She took a deep breath, her gaze sweeping the room. "You've targeted vulnerable residents, people who have spent decades building their lives here, and treated them as obstacles to your profits. That's not progress, it's exploitation. And we're not going to let it continue." The room erupted in applause, and Evelyn felt a surge of strength. She looked directly at the Meridian representatives, her voice firm. "We will hold you accountable. This community deserves better." After the town hall, the energy among the residents was palpable. People lingered outside the community center, discussing next steps and sharing words of encouragement. Evelyn stayed with Mr. Green, ensuring he got home safely. "I have to admit," Mr. Green said as they walked, "you've got quite a way with words, Dr. Carter." Evelyn laughed softly. "You inspire me, Mr. Green. I'll just follow your lead." He smiled, but it faded as they approached his building. A black SUV was parked near the curb, its windows tinted. Evelyn's stomach tightened as she noticed the driver, watching them closely. "Do you recognize that car?" she asked quietly. Mr. Green shook his head. "No, but I don't like the look of it." Evelyn walked him to his door, glancing over her shoulder to make sure the car stayed put. Once inside, she called Nadia and described what she had seen. "They're trying to intimidate us," Nadia said, her tone angry. "But it won't work. We'll file a report. Document everything." Evelyn hung up, her resolve hardening. Meridian was escalating their tactics, but so was the community. That night, as Evelyn lay in bed, she replayed the events of the town hall in her mind. She thought of the elderly woman without water, the young families facing eviction, and Mr. Green standing steadfast in the face of relentless pressure. "We have to win this fight," she thought. Not just for Mr. Green, but for everyone. The road ahead felt daunting, but Evelyn reminded herself of something her father had once told her. Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's doing what needs to be done despite it. With that thought, she closed her eyes, determined to face whatever came next. The tension in the neighborhood continued to build in the days following the town hall. The black SUV that Evelyn and Mr. Green had seen became a regular presence, parked near the building during odd hours, its driver always watching but never engaging. Word spread among the tenants, heightening the sense of unease. Evelyn found herself constantly looking over her shoulder, her usual calm disrupted by the creeping paranoia that Meridian's reach extended further than she realized. Yet, each time doubt crept in, she thought of Mr. Green's quiet resilience, the determination in his voice during the rally, and the applause of the community at the town hall. She couldn't back down. One evening, after a particularly long shift at the hospital, Evelyn returned home to find a note slipped under her door. Her heart sank as she picked it up and unfolded it. The handwriting was unfamiliar, the message chillingly simple. "Stay out of this. You don't know who you're dealing with." She sat down at her kitchen table, staring at the note. A cold fear settled in her chest, but alongside it burned a stubborn resolve. She grabbed her phone and called Karen. "Karen, they're threatening me now," she said, her voice tight with frustration. "A note under my door." Karen's voice was calm but firm. I'm not surprised. They're trying to scare you, Evelyn. It's what they do when they realize they're losing control. What should I do? File a police report, first of all. Even if they don't act on it, having a record is important. And tell your neighbors. The more people who know, the less isolated you'll feel. Evelyn nodded, though Karen couldn't see her. I'll do that. Thanks, Karen. You're not alone in this, Karen said. Remember that. The next day, Evelyn gathered a group of tenants in Mr. Green's apartment. They sat in the cramped living room, their faces a mix of worry and determination. Evelyn held up the note. This is the kind of intimidation they're using now. They're targeting me, and I'm sure I'm not the only one. Several people nodded. One woman, a mother of two, raised her hand. They've been calling me nonstop, offering a buyout. But when I refused, they started threatening to report me for violations I didn't commit. Another man chimed in. They've been sending inspectors to my place every week, looking for anything they can use to evict me. Mr. Green, sitting quietly in the corner, finally spoke. They're trying to break us, but if we stick together, they can't win. His words carried weight, and the room fell silent. Evelyn nodded. Mr. Green's right. They're counting on fear to divide us. But we have strength in numbers. We're filing reports, documenting everything, and building our case. And we're not stopping until they're held accountable. For the first time that evening, Evelyn saw hope flicker in the faces around her. As the days went on, Evelyn threw herself even deeper into the fight. Her time became a balancing act, long shifts at the hospital followed by late nights at community meetings and endless phone calls. She barely slept, and the stress began to take a toll. One night, after spending hours compiling evidence for the legal case, Evelyn sat at her desk, her head in her hands. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced at the screen to see a message from her younger sister, Naomi. Naomi, you've been quiet lately. Everything okay? Evelyn hesitated before typing back. I've fine. Just busy with work. Her sister's response was almost immediate. You always say that. Call me when you can? Okay. Love you. Evelyn sighed, guilt pressing against her chest. She hadn't told Naomi about the fight she was involved in. Part of her didn't want to worry her, and another part felt like it was a battle she had to fight on her own. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. A local journalist, who had attended the town hall, published an article exposing Meridian Development's tactics. The story highlighted several tenants' experiences, including Mr. Green's, and included damning details about the company's history of harassment and illegal practices. The article went viral within hours, shared widely across social media. Community leaders and advocacy groups rallied behind the tenants, and city officials faced mounting pressure to act. Evelyn read the article on her lunch break, her heart racing with a mix of triumph and anxiety. This was the moment they had been working toward, but she knew Meridian wouldn't go down without a fight. That evening, Evelyn visited Mr. Green to discuss the next steps. She found him sitting by the window, looking out at the street below. Good news, she said, holding up her phone. The article's everywhere. People are finally paying attention. Mr. Green turned to her, a faint smile on his lips. That's good. Real good. But his smile faded as he gestured toward the street. They've been parked out there all day. Evelyn followed his gaze and saw the black SUV again, its engine idling as if waiting. Her stomach knotted, but she forced herself to stay calm. We'll report it, she said, and we'll keep fighting. Mr. Green nodded, though his shoulders were tense. You've done so much, Dr. Carter. I don't know how to thank you. You don't have to, Evelyn said firmly. This is about more than just you or me. It's about everyone they've hurt. And we're not done yet. That night, Evelyn stayed up late writing an op-ed to submit to a local paper. She poured her thoughts onto the page, describing the resilience of the community and the need for systemic change. By the time she finished, the first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon. She sat back in her chair, exhaustion washing over her, but so did a quiet sense of purpose. They were making progress, step by step. As she finally crawled into bed, Evelyn thought of her father's words again. Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's doing what needs to be done despite it. The morning after the article went viral, Evelyn woke to a flurry of activity on her phone. Messages and emails poured in, some from reporters wanting to interview her, others from advocacy groups offering support. The exposure was already making waves. She scrolled through the messages, her heart lifting as she read words of encouragement from strangers who had seen the article. One email stood out, a message from a city council member expressing interest in meeting with the tenants. Evelyn immediately forwarded the email to Karen and Nadia, her fingers trembling with excitement. By midday, the neighborhood was buzzing. Tenants gathered outside Mr. Green's building, some carrying signs, others speaking with reporters who had shown up unannounced. The atmosphere was charged with hope, but there was also a sense of tension hanging in the air. Evelyn joined the crowd, her presence greeted with gratitude. Mr. Green stood near the front steps, looking both proud and overwhelmed as he fielded questions from a journalist. "You're becoming quite the public figure," Evelyn teased gently when she approached him. Mr. Green chuckled, shaking his head. "I never thought I'd see the day." "You're doing great," she said, patting his shoulder. "Just keep telling your story." Later that afternoon, Evelyn and a small group of tenants met with the city council member at a nearby community center. The room was modest, with a few folding chairs and a table covered in papers and flyers. Councilwoman Teresa Alvarez was a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s, with a no-nonsense demeanor that immediately put Evelyn at ease. "I've read the article and reviewed some of the complaints against Meridian," Alvarez said, folding her hands on the table. "What they're doing is not only unethical, it's illegal. We have grounds to launch an investigation." A murmur of relief swept through the group. Evelyn exchanged a glance with Mr. Green, whose face softened with cautious hope. "However," Alvarez continued, her tone serious, "this won't be an easy fight. Meridian has deep pockets and a legal team that specializes in dragging cases out for years. Are you all prepared for what this will take?" "Yes," Evelyn said firmly, her voice steady. "So am I," Mr. Green added, his chin lifting slightly. The others nodded in agreement, their determination palpable. "Good," Alvarez said. "I'll make sure your voices are heard at the next city council meeting. But we need to keep the pressure on rallies, media coverage, everything. Don't let up." As the group left the meeting, Evelyn felt a renewed sense of purpose. They finally had someone in a position of power willing to stand with them. It wasn't a victory yet, but it was a critical step forward. That evening, she joined Nadia at another tenants' meeting, where they strategized the next phase of their campaign. The room was filled with energy as residents brainstormed ideas for keeping the momentum alive. One young man suggested organizing a march to City Hall. Another proposed starting a petition to demand stronger tenant protections. Evelyn took notes, her mind racing with possibilities. But as the meeting wound down, Nadia pulled her aside. "Are you okay?" Nadia asked, her voice low. Evelyn hesitated. "I'm fine." "Why?" "You've been running yourself ragged," Nadia said. "You're doing amazing work, but you need to take care of yourself too. This fight isn't going to end tomorrow." Evelyn smiled faintly. "I'll be fine. I just need to see this through." Nadia nodded but gave her a knowing look. "Don't forget you've got a whole community behind you. You don't have to carry this alone." The next few days passed in a blur of activity. The city council announced its investigation into Meridian development, and the media coverage intensified. Evelyn spent her mornings at the hospital, her afternoons with the tenants, and her evenings fielding calls from reporters and advocates. One afternoon, as she was leaving Mr. Green's building, she noticed the black SUV again. This time, the driver stepped out, a tall man in a suit, his expression unreadable. "Dr. Carter," he said, his voice calm but pointed. "Can we talk?" Evelyn's stomach tightened, but she held her ground. "Who are you?" "My name is James Renner. I represent Meridian Development." "I don't have anything to say to you," Evelyn replied, her tone icy. Renner smiled faintly, as though unfazed by her hostility. "I think you'll want to hear this. Meridian is willing to offer a substantial settlement to resolve this matter quietly. All we ask is that you step back from your involvement." Evelyn's anger flared. "You think you can buy us off?" "This isn't about money," Renner said smoothly. "It's about finding a resolution that works for everyone. Think of what you could do with the resources we're offering." Evelyn shook her head, her voice firm. The answer is no. Tell your bosses that we're not backing down. Renner's expression darkened slightly, but he nodded. Have it your way, Dr. Carter. But don't say I didn't warn you. As he returned to the SUV, Evelyn's heart pounded with a mix of fear and fury. She knew Meridian wouldn't stop their intimidation tactics, but she also knew they were starting to feel the pressure. That evening, Evelyn shared the encounter with Nadia and Karen during a conference call. They're trying to scare you into backing off, Karen said. That means we're hitting a nerve. We need to stay the course, Nadia added. They're getting desperate. If we keep up the pressure, we can win this. Evelyn nodded, though the weight of the fight pressed heavily on her. She thought of her father's words again, his voice echoing in her mind. Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's doing what needs to be done despite it. She wouldn't back down. Not now. By the end of the week, the City Council held its first hearing on the investigation into Meridian Development. Evelyn and Mr. Green sat side by side in the crowded chamber, surrounded by supporters and reporters. Councilwoman Alvarez presented the tenants' case with clarity and conviction, highlighting the evidence they had gathered and the testimonies of those affected. Evelyn felt a surge of pride as she watched Mr. Green's story take center stage. When the hearing concluded, Alvarez approached them, her expression resolute. This is just the beginning, she said. But you've made an impact. Don't lose that momentum. We won't, Evelyn promised. As they left the chamber, the crowd outside erupted into cheers. Evelyn saw familiar faces among the supporters: Nadia, Karen, and even the vendor from the market who had given Caleb a sandwich weeks ago. Mr. Green looked around, his eyes glistening. We did it, Dr. Carter. We finally made them listen. Evelyn smiled, her heart swelling with pride and relief. We're not done yet, Mr. Green, but this is a victory, and we earned it. The cheers outside the city council chambers lingered in Evelyn's ears as she walked with Mr. Green through the crowded street. The momentum from the hearing had energized the tenants and their supporters, but Evelyn knew their fight was far from over. Still, for the first time in weeks, there was a sense of real hope, a tangible belief that they could win. I didn't think we'd get this far, Mr. Green said as they turned the corner toward his building. Clara would have been proud. She'd be proud of you, Evelyn replied, her voice warm. You're the reason we've made it this far. You've inspired so many people, Mr. Green, including me. He chuckled softly, leaning on his cane. You give me too much credit, Dr. Carter. I wouldn't have made it through this without you. Evelyn smiled, but before she could respond, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. It was Nadia. Hi, Nadia, Evelyn said, answering quickly. Hey, just wanted to let you know we're organizing a follow-up rally next week to keep the momentum going, Nadia said. The turnout's already looking huge. I think we're really getting through to people. That's great news, Evelyn said, her steps quickening. Let me know how I can help. We'll need speakers again, and I think Mr. Green should lead, Nadia suggested. Evelyn looked over at him as they walked. I'll ask him. I think he'll say yes. Mr. Green raised an eyebrow at her, clearly overhearing. Evelyn gave him a teasing smile and mouthed, We'll talk later. Over the next week, Evelyn balanced her work at the hospital with preparations for the rally. The city council hearing had drawn even more attention to the tenants' fight, and several local organizations reached out to offer resources. Lawyers volunteered their time, while nearby businesses donated food and supplies for the event. One afternoon, Evelyn stopped by the bakery where she had first met Mrs. Patel. She had come to pick up pastries for a planning meeting, but as she approached the counter, she noticed something new. A sign hung on the wall, painted in bold letters. This space supports our community. Mrs. Patel caught Evelyn looking at the sign and smiled. We all have to do our part, don't we? Evelyn felt a swell of gratitude. Thank you, Mrs. Patel. This means so much. The baker shrugged modestly. It's the least I can do. We've all seen what you're doing, Dr. Carter. You've given us hope. The day of the rally arrived, and the park was filled with people. The air buzzed with energy as children ran between rows of chairs, families held up signs, and reporters set up cameras along the edges of the crowd. Evelyn stood near the makeshift stage, her heart swelling with pride as she looked around. Mr. Green sat quietly beside her, dressed in his best suit. His nerves were evident, but his determination shone through. You ready? Evelyn asked, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. He nodded, exhaling slowly. Let's do this. When it was his turn to speak, the crowd fell silent. Mr. Green walked to the microphone with deliberate steps, pausing to adjust it. My name is Harold Green, he began, his voice steady. And this is my home. The audience erupted into applause, and Mr. Green waited patiently for them to quiet before continuing. I've lived here for over 30 years. I've seen this neighborhood change in ways both good and bad. But the one thing that's always stayed the same is the people. The people who care about each other, who look out for each other. His voice grew stronger as he spoke, his words carrying the weight of his experiences. We've faced harassment, intimidation, threats, but we're still here, and we're not going anywhere. The applause was deafening, and Evelyn felt tears prick her eyes as she watched him. We're not just fighting for our homes, Mr. Green continued. We're fighting for our dignity, for the right to live in a place we've built with our own hands. And we're going to win because when a community stands together, nothing can break us. When he stepped down from the stage, the crowd surged toward him, offering handshakes, hugs, and words of encouragement. Evelyn stood back, her heart swelling with pride. That evening, after the rally had ended and the park had emptied, Evelyn sat with Mr. Green on the same bench where they had first met. The sun was setting, casting the sky in shades of gold and pink. You were incredible today, Evelyn said, breaking the comfortable silence. Mr. Green smiled, his eyes reflecting the fading light. I didn't think I had it in me, but you showed me I did. Evelyn looked at him, her voice soft. You reminded me why I became a doctor. It's not just about treating patients, it's about fighting for people, for their lives, their dignity, their future. Mr. Green nodded, his expression thoughtful. You've done more for me than you'll ever know, Dr. Carter, and for this community. Evelyn smiled, her heart full. We've done it together. In the weeks that followed, the ripple effects of the tenants' fight continued to grow. The city council passed new protections for renters, and Meridian Development faced mounting legal challenges. While the battle wasn't over, the balance of power had shifted. Evelyn returned to her work at the hospital with a renewed sense of purpose, but she remained deeply involved in the community's efforts. She attended meetings, offered support to tenants, and became a trusted voice in the fight for justice. As for Mr. Green, he joined a local advocacy group, sharing his story with others and inspiring new generations of activists. One sunny afternoon, Evelyn visited the park, now bustling with life. She saw children playing on the swings, families gathered for picnics, and neighbors chatting under the shade of trees. At the center of the park stood a new mural, painted on the side of the community center. It depicted people of all ages and backgrounds standing together, their hands joined in unity. Below it, a simple phrase was written: "This community belongs to everyone." Evelyn stood in front of the mural, her heart swelling with pride and gratitude. She thought of Mr. Green, of Nadia, of the countless people who had stood together to make this moment possible. And for the first time in a long while, she felt at peace. Thank you for joining us on this journey of courage, resilience, and community. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more powerful narratives that inspire change. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and let us know your thoughts in the comments. Together, we can make a difference.